This is 7th Circle Gaming, and today we're going to be discussing Borderlands 3. And we'll get started like we always do with full disclosure. I'll invite you to pause the video now and read through these at your leisure, or if you'd prefer not to, don't pause the video and we'll move right on to the screenshots. And the first one that we're going to share with you is meant to illustrate mostly what the game world itself looks like, with particular attention to the science fiction type elements, the art style of the game, and the user interface, which is fairly minimalist, although there are some major focus areas, being the bottom of the screen and the top right. And on that note, let's move on to our second screenshot, which is one of the really three that tell the story of Borderlands 3, appropriately enough. And that is the vendor screen, for want of a better phrase, where players are going to be comparing what they've found after engaging with the combat and seeing what the vendors have to offer and seeing whether that's better or worse than what they currently have, which we typically around here call statistics focus. And with that, let's move on to our third screenshot that we're going to share with you, which is the character upgrade path. And here there are more statistics to examine. It could also be necessarily termed player agency. However, the fact that there are more statistics to that does put it more in statistics focus than player agency. But since there really isn't more to say about this, we're going to move on into Chapter 1 and answer the question of what does the game do to get players invested into the game world, which we call immersion. And Borderlands 3 is earned an 11 out of 15 for this. The presentation, as we saw in our first screenshot, is a first-person perspective with third-person driving elements. And the game is presented in the cel-shaded cartoon-type art style in a science fiction setting. So there isn't much for players to relate to, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. What they're looking for is a balance between what players can relate to and what they can't, so that the player has to rely on the game to explain what the game world is and how the rules work. Beyond that, the game is going to be using combat to get players invested into the game world. What we're looking at is special abilities with gun combat, which work kind of like enhanced grenades or very, very focused grenades. Then, as we saw in our second and somewhat our third screenshot, Borderlands 3 is going to be using statistics focus to get players invested into the game world. There are a plethora of statistics for players to examine. We do doubt that the Borderlands has some player agency to get players invested into the game world, in that there is an ability to choose a player appearance through gathering in-game objects or purchasing DLC, which has an effect on the player character appearance. The character path, or the upgrade path rather, could also be termed player agency, although there are some optimal upgrade paths that players are going to want to invest in, but the game does sort of leave that up to the player. In addition, the game could be said to be using story to get players invested into the game world, in the sense that in-game events are presented as part of a larger plot. And finally, For immersion, the game could be said to be using audio. What the player is going to be hearing are the typical combat noises, there are exertion sounds, and a fair amount of referential humor familiar to players of the Borderlands series. And with that, we will just reiterate that Borderlands 3 is earning an 11 out of 15. And let's move on to difficulty. And Borderlands 3, in case you forgot what game we were going to be talking about, has earned a 3 out of 15. It does not seem to favor a gamepad or keyboard and mouse in any way. There are fairly simple difficulty options with impacts that aren't necessarily described. However, that's not necessarily as important as being aware of the weapon and ability selection, which are going to have arguably a more significant impact on gameplay or on difficulty than anything else. So then, let's move on to Chapter 3 since there isn't much to say about difficulty. In Lasting Appeal, Borderlands 3 has earned a 10 out of 15. There is a significant amount of DLC available. There are no mods available for the game, although not through traditional means. It's completely possible that through non-traditional means, it's possible to mod the game. There are multiple characters to choose from. This is pretty typical for Borderlands. The game can be played for as few as 10 minutes or as long as several hours. We find both to be fairly reasonable. There is some in-game content that players can engage with that could keep them playing through the game even beyond completing the story. On the other hand, it could be argued that Borderlands 3 has diminishing returns. That is, over many hours or days of playing through Borderlands 3, that the player begins to notice more of the cracks and more of the spackle that's been used to cover over shortcomings of the game, and they become less interested as time from purchase increases. So the game has earned a 10 out of 15, which just leaves us with the question, what is the game like overall? Well, and that's a very good question because overall Borderlands 3 has earned an 8 out of 15. While it is more Borderlands and we are not ashamed to admit it, it is the classic formula, just with more scenery, more varied scenery rather. There are some cameos from noted performers like Ice-T, Miami Alec, and Penn and Teller for players that are interested or players that notice them. While the story may appeal to some players, others will ignore it to get back to the combat and acquiring items, the primary gameplay loop, as some others might have said it. And with that, that's all there is to say about Borderlands 3 from 7th Circle Gaming. And if you did enjoy the video, great, fantastic. If you've played the game yourself and you've got some opinions about it, please feel free to leave those in the comments section below. Otherwise, from 7th Circle Gaming, good.